Thank you to all our wonderful panelists here for joining us today to talk about the film Pelo, malo. And thank you to those attendees in the attendee zone of Zoom webinar. Please, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat as we go along. But beforehand, I'm just going to give a little introduction and I'll try and keep it brief. So my name is Rachel and I'm a PhD student in Hispanic Studies at the Universities of Cardiff and Exeter. And I'm really thrilled that this event is taking place today. So as I've said in the previous talks, I'm really fortunate enough to have been supported to put on this film festival by Pragda Spanish Film Club, my universities, my funding body, the HRC, and finally my supervisors, Professor Sally Faulkner and Dr. Ryan Prout, to be able to know and be able to put on this event, this kind of virtual Spanish film festival called Screening the Child. So thank you again to all those who I've been emailing and asking to be panelists, because I really appreciate you coming along to talk about your thoughts on the film and of course your brilliant work. So yes, I do encourage participation. So if you have any questions on what's some of the things we're discussing as we're going along, please do pop them in the chat and I'll put them to the panelists when I can. And this Zoom, just for your information, is being recorded, so it's available as an educational resource asynchronously. So just to say a bit about Spanish Film Club, so it's an initiative by Pragda to offer grants, and they offer them twice a year to help high schools and universities bring the very best in contemporary Spanish and Latin American cinema to campuses with the aim of introducing students to the languages and stories. So today we're discussing the film Pelo, malo, and I'm sure we're going to get into it in a more profound way, but just to say this is a film about a 9-year-old boy and generally his desire to straighten his hair. But after reading some of your work on this, it's about a lot more than that, as I'm sure we'll see. So to briefly introduce our wonderful panelists today, I'll just start off with my colleague, Dr. Katie Brown, who is a senior lecturer in Latin American studies, and her research focuses on the interplay between culture and politics in the 20th and 21st century. Research also specializes in Venezuelan culture under the Bolivarian Revolution, 1999 to present. And we were just talking about some of Katie's upcoming work that we're all really excited for, so do look out for that. We also have Adam Feinstein, and he's an award-winning author, poet, translator, Hispanist, journalist, film critic, and autism researcher. And his acclaimed biography of the Nobel Prize-winning Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, A Passion for Life, was published in Bloomsbury in 2004 and reissued in an updated edition in 2013. And he's got a lot more really interesting work, so please do go and have a look at some of Adam's work. We also have my supervisor, Professor Sally Faulkner, and she is an Assistant Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Professor of Hispanic Studies and Film Studies at the University of Exeter. And Sally's research largely focuses on Spanish cinema, where she has particular interest in film and politics, film aesthetics, and film theory. We also have to Rebecca Jarman, and it's really, really nice to meet you, Rebecca, albeit on Zoom. And she is an Associate Professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds. And her research interrogates the intersections between culture, history, and politics in 20th and 21st century Latin America. And she has a book chapter on Pelo, malo that I really recommend, that appears in the Politics of Culture in the Chavez Era. And she also has a forthcoming book titled Representing the Barrios, Culture, Politics and Urban Poverty in 20th Century Caracas. And she's also writing an article about cinema and crisis in contemporary Venezuela. So thank you for joining. And we also have another of my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Natália Pinazza, who is a lecturer in Portuguese Studies, Lusophone and Latin American Culture at the University of Exeter. And we've done lots of film festival stuff before, Sally, Natália and I. And her research focuses on journey narratives, film industry and issues of transnational cinema, with a particular focus on Latin America and the Portuguese-speaking world. She published her first book, Journeys in Argentine and Brazilian Cinema, Road Movies in a Global Era by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014. And welcome also to Professor Maria Delgado, who is an academic, critic and curator whose work in the area of Spanish language and European theatres and Spanish language film has been published in 7 languages. She has long-standing interest in the politics and practices of editing and has been co-editor of the Contemporary Theatre Review since 2001. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, interview with the director of this film that took place at the London Film Festival a few years back. So I'd recommend going and having a look at that as well if you weren't able to be there. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. So I thought it might be quite nice if I just went round and sort of asked everyone for some initial thoughts on the film, whether that be how you came to it, how you, why you enjoy writing about it, why you enjoy teaching it, or why you enjoy it, or what you thought was interesting about the film. So just some general first thoughts. And I wondered if I might pass through my wonderful supervisor, Sally, first of all, to begin, if that's okay.
Thank you very, very much, Rachel, and congratulations on this festival and your introduction, and to choosing this wonderful selection of films that link together so well through the figure of the child. I feel like I shouldn't start, but you've asked me to, so I will, because I come to this film as an enthusiast. I've not written on it. I plan to teach it. I think I'd say just two things and then hand over to my colleagues. So the first, what I love about it is the portrait of contemporary Caracas and Venezuela, and how that links up with the context, those glimpses of Chavez and so on, and the way, so glimpses, and then the gunfire that critics and lots of you on the line have talked about in the background. So we know this wider context through glimpses and sounds, but we're very much focused on the child and on the mother. In reading about the film, I'll just sort of throw this in now. It's made me think about me in particular, and my relationship to it. So somebody who is white and Western and privileged and so on. And there's been a lot of work on this question of perspective through terms that many of you know very well, like the festival film. So a film for an audience that's maybe urban and cinephile and educated and affluent, watching a film about characters who are none of those things. So I think the film does require us to think about our own perspective. And I know Natália has raised the question of colonialist voyeurism. So that worries me, and I'd like to push back a bit. And I think that there needs to be a place where a film can arouse our compassion without making us feel that we're distanced and smug somehow. And in this film, I think it's to do with gender. In the conditions we work now, I don't think we're watching it in the kind of festival circuit as it's been described in negative assessments of the festival film. So just 2 points, but thank you very much for letting me go first.
Thank you very much, Sally. I think they were really good points to start on. And I wondered if anyone had some sort of response or similar or contrasting thoughts, as it were, to that, and if anyone wanted to take the mic.
I don't know whether to come in, because I'm one of those people that program films for festivals. So I was responsible for the UK premiere of the film. And I think it's I think, as with many films, you're raising really complex issues. But I think for a lot of filmmakers who work in the Global South, and if you think about the film, it's produced by two women who've been working together for many, many years, since they studied together in the late 1990s at the Cuban Film School. And often their only way of surviving as filmmakers is to have the work seen at international film festivals and programmed across a number of them where it's bought for distribution, as in fact it was in the UK. So the film was seen at London Film Festival, bought for distribution, and it's a way, I think we need to be really complex when we're thinking about this idea of the festival film, because for a lot of filmmakers in the Global South, and I'm talking especially for women filmmakers here, who often occupy marginalized positions in their own filmmaking cultures, that international festival circuit and the international distribution circuit is a really important way of earning a living. So I think it's a very complex and nuanced discussion. And I know from my conversations with both filmmakers when we presented the UK premiere of the film in 2014, that the reception of the film and the fact that the film was able to circulate across a range of film festivals effectively was really important at a time when both women were having a very hard time for having made the film in post-Chavez Venezuela. So I think it's and it offered them a degree of protection, the international visibility of that film. And that's a really important thing to take into consideration. So I suppose I haven't talked about the film itself. I loved the film. That's why we programmed it for London. Felt it was an important film. I think they're two filmmakers who've been doing very important things since the late 1990s. I think their model of how they make work, supporting each other in an ecosystem which is so often about the brand of the director, they go completely against that, producing each other's films, alternating as producer and director, and of course they're partners in life as well as work. So I think that, I thought it was a really wonderful way of showing a different way of making films, of providing a different kind of ecosystem, a bit like El Pampero in Argentina do, where it's very mutually supportive. And you might be a director on one film and an editor on another, or a producer on another. The important thing is to get the film made rather than your own role on it. So I'm not talking about the film itself. I guess I'm talking about the things that led to its production and its exhibition, and to really get us to think beyond binaries in terms of festival film bad, when we have to think about how these filmmakers survive in countries which are often dominated by Hollywood products, dubbed. So I think it's a very, very complex ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Maria. Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you both bring up kind of the context of film production and film reception. And I think that one of my other brilliant colleagues, Katie, has some points to respond to on that. So I'll pass over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Rachel. Just picking up on that idea that Sally was talking about, and then Maria has come in on as well. One of the articles that is critical of this idea of the film, the festival film, talks about how Pelo, Malo is almost trying too hard to elicit compassion, because it's got a character who is affected by poverty, race and sexuality, but all of those things come together in the film. That the fact that the boy wants to straighten his hair has to do simultaneously with the questions of masculinity and what it means to be masculine in that context, but also to do with race, to do with the fact that he's constantly watching the Miss Venezuela pageants where you're told that only straight hair is beautiful, and it's a context in which if you are recognized for your beauty, you are able to have kind of economic benefits in that you wouldn't have otherwise. So you kind of need to have those three things coming together for the film to work. That's just my response to that.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, so I was just noting down this kind of beauty as currency, and I think that's some really interesting points. And it looks like Natália might have something to respond to on that. Shall I pass over to you?
Yeah, it's more related to Sally's question and Maria's question, Maria's discussion on the festival film, because when we talk about festivals, we are already talking about distribution. And here it's a co-production that incorporates Venezuela, Peru, Argentina, Germany, the Berlin Film Festival, World Cinema Funding, and other European countries. I think that the question that emerges here is whether there is this pressure to produce films that portray a specific type of reality. That is where the problem lies. It's not necessarily portraying the poverty, it's having the pressure to portray that, to kind of please a more paternalistic, voyeuristic spectatorship. So that is the question, not necessarily that I don't also agree with this idea of the festival, and I agree with what Maria Delgado said about the importance of festivals for for filmmakers in the global South, but also understand that some of them are very critical about the subject matter and the pressure to portray their countries in a certain way. So that was just the kind of plug here.
Thank you very much, Natália. Yes, and also I should say that Natália has a really brilliant article in Mediático today about the film called Contextualizing the Malo in the Venezuelan film Pelo, Malo. So I'd really recommend having a look at that. And also I've obviously been recently reading some of your work, so I wondered if you might like to come in at this point. Obviously you have the chapter, and we've had some discussion of the film reception and also binaries, and I know you discussed this kind of the binaries and representation of queerness, so I wondered if you might like to come in at this point with some thoughts.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks very much for the invite and the initiative. Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of building on some of the points that have been made so far, going back to Maria's point about Mariana, Marité, her partner, and the kind of context in which they're working. I think when we kind of situate that in the Venezuelan context as well, that can be quite revealing, because they were working in the context of the reform of cinema laws in 2005. So in 2005, Venezuela went through a period of reforming their laws and basically putting aside a budget for filmmaking in the country. And that budget was managed centrally by the CENAC, which is the Centro Nacional Autónomo del Cine. And the CENAC was kind of linked very much in its legacy to the new Latin American cinema movement. So I'm talking about cinema from the 60s and 70s, sometimes known as third cinema, where directors were called upon to work with communities, to contest the fetishization of poverty, to kind of think about the ways in which cinema can change reality. It can be a kind of revolutionary practice as well as a depiction of revolutions. And for me, that sentiment is very much present in all of Mariana and Marité's work, and especially in Pelo, malo. It forms part of a movement of films. So, for example, we might think of Gustavo Rondón's La Familia as being another film that does this, whereby directors go to communities in Caracas, low-income communities, tower block communities that have a kind of notoriously negative stereotype, that are kind of often deemed to be very kind of violent, angry, aggressive spaces. And they work with these communities to make these films. I mean, in this case, it wasn't that they kind of parachuted in and took a few snapshots and left again. You know, as filmmakers, they were very much working with and alongside the community in a space where El 23 de Enero, this kind of tower block that's depicted in the film, has a really negative reputation in Venezuela among certain circles. It's deemed as being somewhere that's a very kind of violent space, a space of crime, a space of conflict. In latter years under Chavez, it's been deemed a kind of revolutionary hotbed. And there are elements of truth to these stereotypes, as there often are, you know. And I think what I particularly like about the film, there are many, many things I like about the film, but what I particularly like about it is that they don't shy away from these, you know, historically accurate. Researchers have done a lot of work on this particular building, on this particular set of buildings, and that she doesn't shy away from this kind of historically accurate concerns with the different kind of conflicts that emerge there, and yet they're dedicated to giving us another view of this space through the perspective of the child. And the way in which they work with the child, with the actor, and with the space itself is, I think, really thoughtful and reflective and politically committed, and kind of carries on the line in which they have worked historically and as a collective. So as Maria was mentioning, it's not only the director and the producer and that they switch roles, but beyond that, there is a whole family of people really that are present in that film, and that are present in lots of different films from Venezuela, but also from other parts. So just to give you an example, the actor that plays the security guard in Pelo Malo, Beto Benitez, he himself is a director, he's a producer, he does casting for lots of Venezuelan films and films from kind of elsewhere in the region. So it is a really collaborative model that I think is worth emphasising.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was very, very insightful, and I'm really interested to hear more about this kind of collaborative model and the family working behind it. So I hope that we come back to that actually, and also the child's perspective that really comes through in that scene when they're looking out on the balcony and they're looking at all the other flats and what's going on. I thought that was a very powerful scene. Adam,
yes.
I would like to invite you also to share some of your initial thoughts, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to take part, and thank you for choosing a Venezuelan film, which is because Venezuelan cinema doesn't boast the infrastructure of the Mexican, the Brazilian, or the Argentinian film industries, but it's actually produced some extraordinary filmmakers over the years. Back to 1959 with the great Margot Benacerraf, who made the wonderful documentary Araya, a woman, one of the great pioneers. And I would like to point out that Venezuela has this great rich tradition of films about childhood, about children, about the poignancy of that period, young child and adolescence. There are wonderful examples. You've got films by I would pick Solveig Holgerstein's film Maroa, about an 11-year-old girl living with her grandmother. She's learning to survive by stealing and selling porn magazines. And she meets this music teacher and starts to learn the clarinet, and it transforms her life. Of course, the late Elia Schneider's Huele Pega, about glue sniffer. And also the other tradition I've noticed in Venezuelan cinema, which is films about difference, about accepting difference. And again, I would point to Elia Schneider's Tamara, about the acceptance of the first transgender member of Venezuela's National Assembly. So I think in a way, Mariana Rondon's Pelo Malo fits into that long tradition. But there's one film that reminds me of, oddly, and it's not like Latin American at all. It's a Hollywood film from 1948 called The Boy with Green Hair, directed by Joseph Losey, which is a film, again, about accepting differences, and about hair, hairstyle, hair color. And I was wondering if I could just ask Maria whether, when I know she's interviewed Maria Rondon, whether that film ever came up. I doubt it, because it's an obscure film, but it has so many points of interlapping with Pelo Malo, about accepting, as I say, accepting of difference, about the brutality of discrimination, social stigma, subtly done. Well, it's not as subtly done, I have to say, in the Joseph Losey film. It's far more sentimental, and there are not as many nuances, because what Pelo Malo is great about is the ambivalences that run through it, one after another, one after. There's no blacks and no black and whites. You know, the mother and the son relationship is beautiful, because it's like all relationships. You can't characterize it by being one of love or hate. It's both. And of course the son and Junior and the grandmother, again, love, hate. They're wonderful. They're wonderfully depicted. Wonderful. It's a wonderful film for that. It shows human nature in all its nuances. It's a great film for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I agree with you. I like the kind of ambiguity and the nuances in the different relationships between all the characters, actually. And it also made me think of the film Carmen y Lola because there's a lot of this view of the setting of the flats, and there was a visual link there for me, but that's maybe something to unpack at a later date. Thank you very much all for sharing your first sort of initial thoughts. I wondered if anyone had any sort of points that they wanted to come back on, or on anything that's been brought up so far. If not, I've got some questions that I've prepared, but just to give everyone a chance to if they wanted to just bring it back to something that they thought they might have missed. Oh, Natália, please.
It was something that Rebecca mentioned actually about the third cinema aesthetics. And yes, I can see that like in the use of the diversity of shots that are typical of a documentary work, and the neorealist portrayal of the streets, especially the use of non-professional actors in less stage scenes of people going about their lives in Caracas. So it's very interesting that Rebecca brought this cinematic tradition, because you can see that there is a language there, the aesthetics there. So just a comment on the third cinema aesthetics of it.
Thank you very much, Natália. Did anyone else have any points to come back on in terms of the third cinema, or the way that this film kind of challenges? Because I know the same as in when I mentioned Carmen y Lola, this was the same kind of setup, I believe, where they worked with non-professional actors and the people living in the area. And it does make me think of, you know, this sense of realism. Does it heighten the sense of realism in the film? And how does that even underscore further the child's perspective, which I think what Sally was touching on with this kind of glimpse of the socio-political setting. So I wondered, perhaps
I just coming back to Adam's point, I mean they never spoke about the boy with green hair. It may have been a reference point, I don't know. I mean, obviously they are queer filmmakers, and I think it's really interesting. It goes back to that initial point about the festival film, and whether, if it's a co-production, there's particular things that are imposed on a script. You've got to tick the boxes that will, you know, hit a whatever somebody's understanding of a Western viewer might be, and poverty porn might be, but actually knowing Mariana and Marité, that is so far from the way that they work. You know, if you know them as women and as filmmakers, they don't compromise in terms of, and so much of the script is developed. You know, Mariana has a script, but she doesn't give the script to the children. So when she's working, you know, it's not you get that line in or else. There's none of that. The children came up with the script. She feeds them ideas through improvisation. So I think once you know a lot about the way that they work, some of the obstacles they've had as filmmakers, and of course they've had to leave Venezuela because of threats that they had to made to them. You know, they work with a real delicacy. I mean, Mariana is a very delicate director in terms of the ways in which she works with the children. There's a real ethics in her directorial engagement with them, and that goes back to that point about working with communities rather than flying in, filming, and then exiting those communities. And so I think that notion of improvisation, that sense of not rehearsing with the script, that sense of allowing the children to come up with the language of the film in many ways, I think it problematizes this notion of meaning being held in the, you know, that the director somehow controls all meaning. I think it's a far more complex way of making work than that kind of model that's often imposed on filmmakers, especially when, you know, they tick a co-production box. And, you know, with Mariana and Marité, it really isn't like that. I think it's something that flows very much through the organic way in which they work with those children. And they've worked with children. So many of their films are children focused. And I think it's about that alternative gaze, whether it's in effect partly a queer gaze, I think is perhaps a bigger conversation, but it's that think of looking from the margins, looking, you know, from down up to and the sense of perspective of that world looking odd and different, that I think the cinematography, again, you're talking about a woman cinematographer here, Micaela Cajahuaringa, who has filmed all of their work and is part of Sudaca Films, and that gaze, I think, is very, very particular and really quite unique and unnerving.
And if I can just add to that as well, I mean, I think what is also remarkable about their work is the engagement with the audience as a community as well. They're very committed to the idea of audiences as communities and of fostering conversations. And I think in this particular context, that's super important, where communities in Venezuela are under so much peril. So I'll give you two examples related to this specific film, which I think are really important. The first is that, as Maria mentioned, Mariana Rondón, they no longer live in Venezuela, they're based in Peru. And for the MAC, the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo, Mariana provided some of the models that they used in creating the film, some of the kind of extra footage, some of the imagery and so on. And they staged an exhibition at the Museo de Arte Contemporáneo based with some of these kind of photography and images. And in Lima, there are many, many Venezuelan refugees currently, historic levels of refugees from Venezuela living in Lima. And the security guard of MAC, this is anecdotal, the security guard of the MAC was from Venezuela and was very, very moved by this kind of exhibition of, in some ways, kind of national identity. And I'll get back to that point in a moment. But anyway, the following day, he had told kind of others that about this exhibition, and more people were coming through, and it went from kind of being an exhibition that was kind of fairly empty and small scale in a fairly small scale space to one that was visited by many Venezuelans specifically, that kind of saw it as a meeting point or a place of encounter and discussion, of sharing experiences of exile in a city that has not always been entirely welcoming to the Venezuelan community. And Mariana was very much involved in that organic, unexpected initiative, and was very moved by the response that people had. And so I think that's one way in which it's not just about the film as the finished product. You know, it's very much about a commitment to communities beyond the film as a kind of DVD. And the other example that I wanted to give, again related to this film, was that we screened Pelo, malo at Leeds. The university has a small cinema, houses doesn't house anybody. It seats about 60 people. And we did a screening, and Mariana came and did a Q&A, and we hadn't necessarily targeted the Venezuelan community in the north. We'd thought more that students would come along, and they did, but we also had I wouldn't be able to say exactly how many, maybe a couple of dozen Venezuelans come along who had got to the event through social media. And a lot of the discussion focused around this kind of display of I suppose, images and sensations and discussions that are kind of very much in keeping with the Venezuelan experience. So the audience was particularly interested in the scene. There's a scene where Junior puts mayonnaise on his hair to try and straighten it, and the audience was saying, you know, how are they wasting this mayonnaise now in the context of shortages? You can't imagine this was in 2016, wasting mayonnaise on your hair, whereas kind of thing that you could imagine. And again, the director was very much involved in discussions and was very, very sympathetic to actually what ended up being a very emotional discussion about this kind of collective experience of dislocation that was mediated through the film, and is mediated in some of the themes of the film, when we think about kind of a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of origin, and so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, thinking around the kind of peripheries of the film can be really helpful to try and understand what the film does and what its directors are trying to do as well.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think it is really important what you bring up about kind of creating this discussion and thinking around the peripheries of the film. And I wondered if anyone might have some reaction to that, or might be in agreement.
I have one question, really, because I've been hearing this organic word, organic approach, and that's very interesting. But for me, because obviously the spectator in the film is very much focused on the domestic sphere, and we get clues of what is happening beyond the camera, beyond what's being framed by the sounds of gunshots, people shouting, traffic noise. And there is also, but I have one question about this organic approach to the child and the way that the spectator gets a glimpse of the external world through the children. Because their games mimic the world outside. So it's very interesting when you said about children being trained and in bringing their own improvisation and so on, because they incorporate rape, violence as part of their interactions amongst dolls, and that is brutal. And that is quite interesting to also question whether this was an initiative that a child would have made. Perhaps he would, because there is this tendency to obviously mimic the outside world. But is this something that was staged, for instance?
I didn't talk about the child being trained. I mean, I think that when you work with children as performers, it's a very different process. It's often a very delicate process. They're not trained. If you're working with trained actors, it's very different. They'll have an intuition for particular gestural language. Their voice will be trained in a particular way. They'll process information differently. She works with non-professional actors, and I think that that's often a very different way of working. I think, you know, when I use the word organic, I think it's about a process of play. I think it's a process of listening and playing with the children on their level. And I think this is something that they have worked with extensively throughout their entire cinema career. I think the issue of, I mean, they live in a very violent society. I mean, the gunshot is a backdrop to almost all the action. You've got, it's a noisy film. You've got the gunshots, you've got the traffic. It's a noisy, busy world. And I think that, you know, when I think for me, you know, when, you know, Nina that little girl talks about, returns to the motif of rape as they're playing, that she'd rather die than be raped by one of his toy soldiers. I think it's a dreadful indictment of a world where a child grows up where and rape is just part of the kind of discourse of that world. And I think it's just one of the most shocking moments in a film, I think, of the last 10 years for me. But you think about the ways in which children, and you know, it's not just in the global south. Look at the cross-country drug rings that you see in across England. You know, that children, you know, children become involved unwittingly, often abusively in particular kind of regimes and dynamics, which are profoundly abusive. So I think it's very much a film about social indoctrination, and I think it's a film about the ways in which culture, society, gender expectations work to limit the opportunities for children, especially children of a very particular socio-economic demographic. And I think that's very, I think it's very skillfully handled in the film. So you know, I think the way they pose in their outfits as an action man or as a princess, I mean, that's about a society that sees gender politics in very particular ways. And if you talk to Mariana and Marité and hear about their own experiences, and it's interesting, Rebecca was talking about Mariana's work as a visual artist. And she'd obviously worked as a visual artist concurrently with her filmmaking, and often her work around space is about how the body is read and operates in space as a site of surveillance and abuse. And those children are very easy targets, and I think that's very visible in the ways in which they are filmed, and their language is captured in the language of the film.
Yeah, absolutely. There is no denial of that. I would just ask for, like, even out of curiosity, because for children, for instance, filmed in the favela, it has been very controversial, the approach to training and kind of induce them to act in a certain way. And then I heard the word organic, and I would just like to kind of.
But there's a long history of abusive work, which, I mean, if you, look at Judy Garland. I mean, look at Judy Garland. You're not talking about the global South. I mean, abuse happens. Abuse has been part of the way child performers, and there's a long body of literature.
I was not talking about Judy Garland, and we just brought that up, that brutal scene that I think that they were mimicking violence in rape within the context of Venezuela, the gunshots. It's very interesting. I thought that particular scene of Pelo, Malo was interesting to raise those questions as well. And it's not about child abuse either. It's just about the filmmaker's approach to poverty again, and questions related to that. That's what I wanted to kind of engage with this debate. And also because you met her and you interviewed her, and I was generally curious to know more about the filmmaker and the representation and her approach.
I think she's very receptive. I think she doesn't go in with a very clear sense of what she wants. I think she's very responsive to what play and improvisation creates. So even if she's got a script, and this often happens with people who work with children, you can't give children, if you've ever been on a film set with children or worked with child performers, it's very difficult to give them a script and say, here you go. It doesn't really work like that. I also think that, you know, there is something around the ethics of how you work with children. And these are two filmmakers, Mariana and Marita, who've been working with children for a very, very long time as the central protagonists of pretty much all their films. So I think they've developed an ethics of practice that I think is really admirable and very moving in many, many ways.
Thank you very much, both. That was insightful. I'll pass over to you, Rebecca. Sorry.
I was just going to say very briefly about the kind of biographical detail as well, kind of linking to ideas of childhood being a site of seeing otherwise, seeing differently, kind of challenging perceptions or hierarchies and so on. Mariana's talked publicly about her own childhood in Venezuela, and the fact that her parents were members of an armed insurgents group, and one of her early films, Postales de Leningrado, is a kind of autoethnography, in some ways fictional, of her own childhood, and so I think that also kind of bleeds into these films, and it bleeds into Pelo, Malo as well, the way in which childhood can be a site of rebellion, it can be a site of curiosity, and yet children also somehow at the same time are seeking stability and reassurance. So childhood can't really be understood in binary terms at all, and so it's a very appealing creative space, both in terms of the pragmatics of filmmaking but also in terms of the thematic concerns.
And also the ways in which children are used by the adults in their life as pawns. And I think that's very evident in the film. Junior is used by his mother and his grandmother. So I think there's also a non-idealization that often parents treat, and grandparents and relatives do not treat children very well. So I think it's also about what constitutes love, in inverted commas, is really problematic in their films. And I think that's very evident in Postales de Leningrado as well, where, you know, the children are carried with their parents wherever their parents' next guerrilla assignment is, and you know that again, the ethics, this issue of ethics, I think is really important in both of their film careers and their filmmaking.
Thank you very much. Yes, in a way you can sort of read that. Yes, sorry, I'll pass over to you, Adam.
No, sorry, I was just going to say the ambivalence, again, it comes back to the ambivalence of the love-hate and the tenderness. There's a lot of tenderness in the human relations amongst the brutality. I mean, the very first scene in the film almost is on the bus with Junior starting to sing and the mum moving to the seat. You can't stand it and moves to the seat in front. You think this is going to be we're going to have a difficult relationship here. But then also you can see the tenderness very quickly. Maria, I think you're quite right to talk about the noisiness of the film. Sound seems to be as important for Mariana Rondon as it is for someone like Lucrecia Martel in Argentina. Sound is as important as the images. And if you have, but actually, it's also a film about seeing and not seeing. So because let's be honest, it doesn't present externally a very flattering picture of Caracas. You know, the high-rise buildings, the walls are flaking. People are, we're seeing a lot of poverty, and of course Mariana Rondon is not moving away from that. She doesn't want to escape from that, but it's all about the internal beauty of people, of course. And so there are lots of mirrors, there are lots of windows, lots of mirrors, lots of windows. I know she said, I think maybe in the interview with you, Maria, that she said the window is an important. So the mirror is a window to the soul, to the interior beauty, and often there's a lot of dialogue where the mother says to Junior, "Don't look at me like that. Don't stop looking at me. Stop looking at me." And then there's one scene with the reverse. Of course, you have the reverse where Junior says, "Look at me, stare at me." I think he's up on the chair, and he's saying, "Stare at me." So it's a film about looking, but not seeing. It's very interesting in that way. Because David Thompson wrote a book called The Big Screen, where he talks about cinema being both a screen that shows you things and also hides things. Screen, the two meaning of the word screen in English. And I think in some ways this is a film about that double meaning of the word screen for me.
Definitely, I'm happy you brought that up, Adam, because it's what you're not allowed to look at and what you're allowed to look at. And I was thinking about that scene in the chair as well, and the levels of that scene and how that played out, and I found it quite powerful. Thank you very much. There's very insightful points coming up so far. I wondered, Katie, if you'd had any thoughts on some of the things that had come up so far, or alternatively, there was also a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see that one from Claire about what may be fueling the homophobic panic.
Yeah, first I just wanted to pick up on that idea about it being a very noisy film, which I'm glad other people mentioned, because it's something that really hit me on this rewatch. It's not something that I remembered. I remembered the film much more about kind of the child's gaze. I think a bit like Rebecca was saying about wasting the mayonnaise, for me it was quite strange seeing such a busy streets in Venezuela, having seen more recently about how many people are now leaving. But I think Claire raises a really interesting point that for as much as you want to, or the mother makes you feel really uncomfortable, there is a sense here that she is just trying to protect her child as well, that she is genuinely scared that he will be a victim of either outright kind of homophobic attacks or discrimination. I've been teaching with my second years a film called Azul y no tan rosa, which is about a man whose partner is a victim of a homophobic attack and kind of it dies from that and then has to kind of try to rebuild his life afterwards. And so as part of that, we do look at kind of the statistics, and there's huge amounts of homophobic violence, or kind of a slowness to bring in laws that protect against that. But then I think, as Claire points out, the Junior's grandmother also shows that there is so many other kinds of violence that is so encouraged through this idea of a very hegemonic masculinity that involves you to show that you are masculine, you must prove yourself through violence, and the fact that she seems to have lost her own son through violence, I think pushes her towards hoping that if Junior is allowed to express himself in other ways without that violence that's so much at the heart of that idea that the boy must dress up in the military uniform and the militarization of Venezuelan society generally. So you can kind of see where both characters are coming from and why they both are trying to protect Junior, but also, as people were saying earlier, also have their own interests at heart as well.
Definitely, it raises a lot of questions on agency from my perspective. And yeah, Sally, please.
Thank you. I don't know if this is going to be helpful, but as some of us are located, as it happens, in the UK and some in the North, and given what Katie was just saying, and also Claire's question about the way these films lead us to understand the backgrounds, and they're not black and white, as Adam was saying. So the UK bit is that it does remind me of Billy Elliot, the 2000 film. And I don't know, Maria, if you know that if the director and producer would sort of balk at that comparison. And there are different responses to that film, but I do think it's a treasured film for some UK audiences. I was trying to problematize the idea of distance in the festival film, in that why am I allowed to watch Billy Elliot if I happen to be from the north of England and that's okay? And I can look at the father and how uncomfortable he is with the fact that Billy dances and implied homophobia and so on. So why is it okay for audiences to be able to engage with that, but not with when similar things happen in this film? I think the sort of condemnations of that and the accusation of poverty porn, I think are unfair. I think that they sort of paint all festival audiences with the same brush, that we're all white, male, urban, cinephile, etc. So I don't know if anybody else found that useful. I suppose thinking of the representation of the child and Rachel's work and many others, that figure does allow us to make comparisons transnationally, which is a part of the excitement, I think.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, it's interesting thinking of kind of the intersections or the junctures, as it were, of the spectator's positionality when viewing the film. And I wonder if anyone has some comments to follow on from some of Sally's points there.
I think, Sally, it's also a film about creativity. I mean, if you think about Billy Elliot, I mean, there's something about the boy's body as a dancing body, as a singing body, that I think that there's something that's created in the mise en scène in both films that creates a degree of the uncomfortable about it. I think it's quite interesting that the mother loves her security guard uniform. Talks about the action man, but she really loves that uniform. And in a society where she is treated pretty badly, it's a status symbol to have a uniform like that. So I think this is one of the things that make it so complex to come up with kind of sweeping judgments about the film, because I think it's constantly undermining these kinds of easy judgments, making it very hard for us to take those entrenched positions as viewers. But I think there is something, I mean, about creativity as an outlet for frustration. And I think in both you're dealing with class as a really important issue. And I think it's something really timely about it. I think now about what happened in this country with the kind of designation of non-foundational subjects, things like music and art. And if you volunteer in primary schools, state primary schools and secondary schools, you will see the difference in terms of provision for music, drama, art, dance. And that's really worrying, because you see what creativity means to the children in the film. You see it also in Billy Elliot, and what's happening when we're being told by society that those things aren't valued in the way that's happening in both those films. So I think in many ways they're both about utilitarian societies where there is no place for creativity or play, when we know that that is central to the ways in which we envisage ourselves and the ways in which we envisage a world, and changing the world as well. Actively, children create other identities and other beings through play. And I think there's an element of sadness in the fact that certain types of play are frowned on or seen as not appropriate, when the whole point is that there is a limitless quality to the imagination, and the possibilities that it allows. And that's very, very evident, I think, also in Billy Elliot.
I think
Definitely.
as well, it's
Please go ahead.
sorry, I mean, on the flip side, I suppose, is it's also a celebration of these things, right? Because, you know, the fact that these children are in these films suggests that there is a kind of element of creativity in play that's being celebrated. And I know in many of the Venezuelan films that feature children, often the children are casted because agents visit schools with kind of renowned theatre histories. They visit kind of community theatre productions. And I'm not talking here about, again, kind of linking back to class, actually, I'm not talking about particularly privileged schools or private schools, actually quite the opposite. There's a kind of network of children's theatre companies, of community theatre centres, and of schools with a kind of history of allowing children to play and to create in the performing arts that feed into these films quite directly. And so there is a kind of a celebration of that as well, I think, in this film, both in terms of the content and also the kind of the making of.
I'm not sure. I think Natália wanted to come in, and then shall I come to you, Adam, afterwards? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'd just like to build on Sally's point that it's quite interesting, because I think that the approach to gender norms actually contextualize the film both locally and globally, which is something that is something really that drew me to this film as well. And one of the things that that is local reading of this film, for instance, is that because his desire to dance and straighten his hair, there is this whole idea of being called marica. And it's worth noting, for instance, that Brazilian President Bolsonaro, he has recently used this term, marica, to state that Brazil was a country of maricas, a country over coronavirus, for instance, which reveals how ideologies of gender that seek to exclude individuals from this sort of patriarchal national narrative continue to inform contemporary politics in South America. I don't imagine like the Boris Johnson saying that necessarily. So, so it's very interesting, this contextualizing locally and globally the film. So that's my point. And just one thing I would like to say about Claire's question, and about the fact that the question, because Katie mentioned that the mother was protecting the child, but the grandmother was also protecting the child. You know, the child managed to carve out space to self-express himself, and also it was his grandmother was the only point of reference to Afro-Venezuelan culture. So it's quite interesting to see that questions of gender and race revolve around the tension between the two female subjects, and in his mother and his grandmother, who respectively sanction and reject this patriarchal model of masculinity, which obviously is epitomized by the absent father figure. So I find quite interesting this tension in how that reflects also the gender norms, but also racial issues. So just 2 comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Yeah, it's really interesting. I like what you say about carving out a space, and I think it links back to Maria and Rebecca's points about dance, singing, and music, and the way it is the director works with the children as this idea of children carving out a space, and linking back to like these kind of children's theatre companies that Rebecca was talking about. Thank you very much. I wanted to give you a chance to come in here, Adam. I know you had some points.
Yes, no, I just wanted to come back to the point I made initially about acceptance, not just acceptance of difference. I'm an autism specialist and I have a son with autism, so I especially admired, enjoyed, felt touched by the film's embracing of the right to be different, to stand out, and I thought that was very important. Just a quick question for Maria, because we haven't really talked about the performances, which are extraordinary. Junior, played by Samuel Lange Zambrano, and Samantha Castillo as the mother Marta, and of course not to forget Nelly Ramos as the grandmother, who's none of them are professional actors. But as far as I know, Maria, none of them have appeared in a feature film since Pelo, Malo. I don't think they've made another film, have they?
I don't think so. Rebecca might know if they've worked in something that may not have been, seen.
I just wonder why they hadn't been. Well, I just wonder why they hadn't been tempted back because they.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complex, isn't it? It's complex when you create a film in a very particular way, where your co-participants in the rendition of both the script and the product, and I think often a lot of commercial work functions in a very different way and can be difficult for people to make that transition around. If you've worked with an ethics of care, I think it can be very difficult to work in different ways, and there's quite a lot of literature around this, different ways of working with children. I mean, and often with non-professionals. I mean, Ken Loach talks a lot about this in terms of his own work, that he often keeps in touch with the non-professional performers he works with, and there's a sense in which it can be quite a disarming experience to be placed in that world and then go back to whatever you were doing before, and there's a need to negotiate that with care. And I go back to the word ethics, but I think that's an important, the issue of an ethics of care is important when you're dealing with children, but also with non-professional performers. So I think there could be an element of that. I mean, it's interesting you talked about the performances. I think I agree with you. I think they're terrific, and I love Nina. Maria Emilia Subaran. I think is just. I just wanted to just hug her. I just think, she is just. I mean, there is just something about her that just breaks my heart when I see that film, and yeah. So I just think there's just. The performances are really unmannered, and that's not easy. It really isn't easy.
Thank you, Maria. And Rebecca, did you want to come in?
Well, just to say, I think Samuel had been in a music video. That's how he was kind of spotted. They did casting all over the country, as I mentioned, as often the case in Venezuelan films, or any films really with children, I think specifically. But he'd been in this music video, and eventually they kind of came around to seeing that, and that's how he was cast. But he hasn't gone on to do anything else. I don't think he wants to either. I mentioned Beto Benitez, the security guard. Sorry, not the security guard, the boss, who has been in many Venezuelan films, and he's currently working on a film of his own that he's been directing, but the situation in Venezuela is such that it's very difficult to continue working in film, and that is the case for the other actors in the film as well. So not only do you have the complication of ethics and whether the actors may want to, who haven't starred in a film before, may want to carry on with their acting careers, they may not want to. That might be a kind of one-off experience. And those who do want to often will struggle, certainly at the moment if they're from Venezuela, because the infrastructure that I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the CENAC, has more or less collapsed. So the funding that was there, that Pelo, Malo received, and that many other Venezuelan films have received before seeking funding internationally, lots of these Venezuelan films would receive the majority of their funding from the CENAC. That's all but disappeared. So these opportunities aren't as current as they, or numerous as they have been in the past. However, I must say that there are opportunities internationally, and what we've seen over the kind of course of the past 10 years or so, I think beginning with Pelo, Malo, which is why when we think about the history of Venezuelan film, the recent history of Venezuelan film, really Pelo, Malo is key, because it kind of integrates or inaugurates this kind of international circuit for Venezuelan filmmakers that hadn't really been, let's say, developed, for want of a better word, as much as it might have been in the past. And so you've got a lot of Venezuelan actors, directors, cinematographers and so on who now live internationally and who are collaborating on international co-productions without necessarily having the Venezuelan label in the title, which in and of itself brings its own complexities, because actually for a film to enter in film festivals and for it to be branded as being a film as being of a certain nation, you need to have correct certification, and the Venezuelan state is currently not certifying Venezuelan films. So that kind of takes us into a whole new dimension of complexities. But just to finish with one quite interesting example, which I think links quite well to the discussion that we've been having around actors who are not professionally trained who star in these films. So there's a film called Desde Ya by Lorenzo Vigas, which I really recommend that you see, because it relates very well to this film in many different ways. And the protagonist of that film, José Luis Silva, stars alongside Alfredo Castro. So Alfredo Castro is a very kind of well-known figure, of course, in Latin American cinema. José Luis Silva had been in one film, Venezuelan film before, although he was cast because he went to an audition kind of on a whim. So he wasn't professionally trained, although he did some theatre at school. He was cast in Desde Ya, which was hugely successful on the international circuit, and he has since left. He's living outside of Venezuela, and he's an example of somebody that really wants to pursue a career in acting, and is currently co-writing a film with another Venezuelan filmmaker. And is trying to kind of establish himself, but it's difficult. It's really difficult because all of the networks of formal support have collapsed, and plus the fact that he, like many others, are trying to establish themselves personally in a new country, and therefore kind of continuing to act and to pursue professional priorities is not always possible. So I think, along with all of the kind of ethics and questions of, you know, what opportunities exist for the protagonists of such films after they have been screened, I think you've got a whole set of other questions in the Venezuelan case where the complexities of pursuing professional aspirations, if you want to, are just on another level, really.
Rebecca, I wonder if it's also around the identification of actor and role. So because he played a gay character in the film, he was actually targeted by homophobic groups. So one of the reasons he left Venezuela initially was because he'd been threatened with his life. So I think there's also, you know, when you're playing, you're taking on queer characters, I think you're even more vulnerable as a child playing effeminate roles. There's also a safety issue at play. So I know that Lorenzo was very, very concerned about the actor's safety in the initial aftermath of Desde Ya being released. So I think there's a real complexity around what happens when you have, and celebrity culture gives an over-identification between actors and roles, and there's ethical consequences to that kind of to what that kind of identification can lead to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the film that he's working on now is not I don't think it is about the queer experience. It's more about the experience of exile, in fact. So I think the actor does want to, Jose Luis Silva does want to move away from that particular role. But you're right. I think there's definitely, especially in a context where that film wasn't made for Venezuelan audiences, partly because of concerns over the way in which Venezuelan audiences would possibly react. There's the risk of then typecasting or kind of restraint in the future.
And going back to Pelo, Malo, Mariana talked about the fact that when she made the film, there's a wonderful quote by her where she says, "We are in a war situation where politics are invading all our private spaces in Venezuela. Politics has stolen them, seized them, and transfigured them." So the idea in which the space makes it very difficult for them to work when it's been colonized, and you get that in the film, of course, the way in which the language of Chavismo is very, very pervasive in terms of the ads and the evangelism. But I think that in both cases, you're talking about how filmmakers negotiate those incredibly difficult situations. And in both cases make, I think, profoundly political films. You forget, and I think that goes back to, you began with the idea of the festival film, and in both cases, these filmmakers have been threatened. I mean, Mariana was threatened by Venezuelans after she made the film, because it was not presenting Venezuela allegedly in a positive light, whatever that might mean. But I think that there's a real complexity there that is often, when sweeping judgments are made about these films as festival films, these nuances, these complex nuances, which are very, very there, are ignored or flattened, and that's deeply problematic.
Yeah. Can I just say something quickly? There's a very good quote. It may have been with your interview, Maria, with Mariana Rondón, and she said, in this film, I gave the audience the freedom to put themselves. I tried not to judge my characters. I let them be who they were. I gave the audience the freedom to put themselves in their shoes and identify with any one of the characters based on their own story. I think that's another very impressive aspect of the film, that it's something that's a strength of actually very few directors do that, where you get the impression, actually very few world directors where they do not judge. I mean, I look to the past, people like Jean Renoir. I remember when I interviewed his son, Alain, and he said, the thing about my father was he never ever made judgments in real life as well about people. I don't know whether Mariana's like that in real life, that she doesn't make judgments about people. I suspect she probably is. But that's the strength of the film. I think she leaves it to the audience to make up their minds. And that's another, it goes along with the nuances. There's so many nuances in the film. It's a very rich film. I've seen it a few times, and I get a lot more out of it each time I see it. Pelo, malo.
But Adam, I wonder if it goes back to the point that when you live in particular kinds of society, making a pronounced judgment can result in a loss of life. That words, we're very aware that language and the language of rhetoric has been used, abused, taken on, and Chavism. I mean, watching the film again in the aftermath of Trumpism,
Yes.
The ways in which language is hijacked towards very problematic ends. I think I think you're talking about a filmmaker who's deeply sensitive to these kinds of nuances.
That's an extremely good point, Maria. Yeah, the climate she's working in, the country she's working in, yeah, you have to be careful. You have to be very careful. I mean, as you said, she's been threatened. Yeah, lexicon. The film lexicon is so you have to be so delicate with it, so diplomatic. Well, not diplomatic, but so careful anyway, so cautious. Yeah.
Thank you both. I'll just pass to you, Natália, for what could be one of the final remarks of the discussion. You're still on mute, I think.
So yeah, it is quite interesting because at the same time, the ending is quite prescriptive in a way, because there is this link between dominant gender paradigms in hair. So the hair is like a palimpsest, and which is played out in the closing sequence. So you have the hairless junior who does not sing along to the national anthem with the other school children. And then after the closing sequence, the film introduces a video of Junior dancing with his straight hair. And the image is like, is a montage. So basically the credits are just juxtaposed. They juxtapose the video, and this montage obstructs the narrative progression from the closing, from the final sequence. In that kind of allows free reign to Junior self-expression, and because but it's through the editing that the film provides an alternative and unlikely ending, which then goes a bit to this kind of prescriptive transition from oppression to freedom, in which undermines the kind of violent masculinity that is related to also national discourses, political discourses. So at the same time, it's non-judgmental. There is a prescription there, I feel.
Thank you, Natália. Would anyone like to come in on some of Natália's points there, or if not, that's also okay.
I think, there's something really interesting about his, he stares out from this kind of regimentalized formation where he's taken his position. The hair's gone, but the gaze is still really bold. It's rebellious and it's firm. And I think, you watch his fellow pupils slavishly singing out the national anthem, but I think his silence suggests he's really not prepared to toe the party line. So I think there's a defiance there. The silent child, of course, we see it with the gaze, the fixed gaze of the characters played by Ana Torrent in El Espíritu de la Colmena and Cría Cuervos. So I think there's something quite defiant in that child looking out and determined to stare the world out.
Yeah, and I think Mariana herself has said the fact that the film is open-ended means it's an optimistic film. It means we can look to the future. We don't know what the future holds, but there is a future. There is a future, and so in the end, she wants it to be an optimistic film, I think, from that point of view. Yeah.
And anybody who's had a bad haircut knows that hair does grow back.
Very true. Well, in these times of the pandemic, we're all struggling with haircut.
We were just talking at the beginning, weren't we? I think that's an excellent point to bring the discussion to an end, because I'm aware that at this busy point in the term and in the world and in our lives, we'll all have things to be going on to do, or home lives to tend to. So thank you so much for all your fascinating and insightful points, and I really appreciate that you've all taken the time to sort of prepare and watch the film and bring together your thoughts and notes and remarks. And I'd really encourage any attendees or anyone watching this in the future to go and have a look at all of the panelists and the work that they do. I know that Katie's also put a very important link in the chat. I don't know if you want to mention that briefly, Katie, about the cinema resource.
Yeah, it's a new site that's just been set up fairly recently called Cine Mestizo, where you can pay between $1 and $5 or something per film to stream a whole range of Venezuelan films. So from things that have been released this year to some of the Venezuelan classics, and they're constantly trying to add to it. One of the problems is actually that a lot of films just don't exist anymore, that as Rebecca was talking about with kind of the breakdown of infrastructure, that they've been trying to add films to this platform but cannot find the prints, or the prints have just been destroyed. But yeah, they're doing what they can to kind of get films out there.
And isn't that brilliant? And so please do go and have a look at that. And as I say, please look up all the panelists' work here today, because some of the points that you might have wanted to know more on actually feature in some of their writing and their discussions and their videos. So please go and do that. Thanks to you all, attendees and panelists, for supporting me as a graduate student, as it has been for me, and I'm sure it has been for the attendees and viewers of this. It's been insightful, fascinating, so interesting and motivational for my own writing. So thank you again. I will circulate an email with the recording and some relevant links and further. And I've actually very much enjoyed all of these film talks. So thank you so much for going through this part of the lockdown with me and participating in this virtual film festival and talks, because it's been a real, silver lining of the situation that we are in. Thank you so much for your time. Please email me with any questions, concerns, queries. Do have a look at the film festival page. Just give a Google Screening the Child Spanish Film Club and you should be able to find the information. There are more films to come. Your Niña is la próxima película. But you can still view Pelo, Malo today, I believe, and we have lots of resources on there, such as links to the panelists' work and video essays and all sorts of things. So please do have a look at the page or drop me a line. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely evening.